I spent the night in a cemetery, the whole night, alone. And what happened there, I still can't explain it, not fully. There are things that happen in the dark that your mind refuses to accept in the daylight. Things that make you question what is real, what is imagination, and what is something else entirely. Something older, something that doesn't have a name. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 34 years old. I work as a freelance documentary filmmaker based out of Columbus, Ohio. I've spent years chasing stories that most people are too afraid to tell. Abandoned hospitals, forgotten prisons, places where tragedy left its mark on the walls and the floors and the air itself. I've slept in places that would make most people run. I've heard sounds that I convinced myself were nothing. I've talked myself down from ledges of fear more times than I can count. But nothing prepared me for what happened at Hollow Creek Cemetery on the night of October 14th. Nothing. I'm going to tell you everything, every moment, every sound, every shadow that moved when it shouldn't have. I'm going to be as honest as I possibly can, because the only way to process what I experienced is to say it out loud, clearly, without flinching. And I need you to stay with me all the way to the end, because what happened in the final hours before sunrise, that's the part that changed everything. That's the part I almost didn't survive telling. Stay with me. The story begins 3 weeks before that night. I was at a coffee shop in Columbus, going through old local news archives for a project on forgotten Ohio history, when I came across a small article buried in a 1987 edition of the Columbus Dispatch. The headline was brief, almost casual. It read, "Caretaker of Hollow Creek Cemetery found disoriented on grounds after overnight stay." The article was only 4 paragraphs long. It described how a man named Gerald Watts, the cemetery's groundskeeper of 11 years, had been discovered by a visiting family at dawn, sitting in the middle of the cemetery grounds, unresponsive and pale, his eyes open but unfocused, his shoes missing, and his hands folded neatly in his lap as if he had simply sat down in the middle of a task and forgotten to move. He was taken to the hospital. He recovered physically within 2 days. But the article noted, in its final sentence, that Gerald Watts never returned to the cemetery. He quit without notice and reportedly refused to speak about what had happened to him that night. That sentence hit me in a very specific place. The place where documentary filmmakers feel the pull of a story. I made a note. I bookmarked the archive. And then I went looking. What I found over the following 2 weeks was not nothing. It was very much not nothing. Hollow Creek Cemetery is located on the eastern edge of Franklin County, just outside the small suburb of Reynoldsburg. It's one of the oldest active burial grounds in central Ohio, with records going back to 1831. The grounds cover approximately 14 acres. There are over 3,000 burials on record, and historians estimate there may be an equal number of unmarked graves from the 19th century, particularly from periods of disease and poverty, when proper burial records were not consistently maintained. The cemetery is maintained by a private preservation trust. It is technically open to the public during daylight hours, but it is not a well-visited place. There are no famous names buried there, no dramatic monuments, no real historical tourism draw. It is simply old and quiet, and largely forgotten by the surrounding community. But the community had not forgotten all of it. As I dug into local historical societies, community forums, and old newspaper archives, a pattern began to emerge. Not a clean pattern, not a sensational one, but a quiet and persistent one. Over the span of roughly 80 years, from the mid-20th century to the present, there had been at least 9 documented incidents in which individuals who spent significant time alone on the cemetery grounds at night reported experiences that they struggled to articulate. Disorientation, sensory confusion, the overwhelming feeling of being watched. Sounds that had no clear source. In 2 cases, individuals described seeing figures moving between the headstones. that upon investigation turned out to have no physical explanation. None of these reports were supernatural claims in the dramatic sense. None of them involved the kind of spectacular imagery that gets turned into horror movies. They were quieter than that, more human, more disturbing for their mundanity. A woman named Patricia Hensley reported in a 1994 community newsletter that she had visited the cemetery late one evening to place flowers on her mother's grave and had heard, clearly and repeatedly, her own name spoken in a low voice from somewhere behind her. She turned multiple times. There was no one there. She left quickly and did not return after dark. A pair of urban explorers who documented their visit online in 2009 described hearing what they could only call layered breathing while standing near the oldest section of the cemetery, close to the original 1831 plots. They described it as the sound of many people breathing slowly, at slightly different rhythms, coming from below them. They left within 40 minutes of arriving. A local historian named Raymond Chu, who spent several evenings cataloguing headstones in the early 2000s, wrote in an unpublished manuscript, which I was able to obtain through a historical society contact, that he had experienced 3 separate episodes of what he called temporal displacement. He described sitting to rest against a headstone, checking his watch and noting the time, and then becoming aware of his surroundings again to find that between 60 and 90 minutes had passed with no memory of the interval. This happened to him on 3 separate occasions in the same section of the cemetery. He noted in his manuscript that he was in good health, did not drink, and had no history of blackouts or dissociative episodes. He concluded, with the careful hedging of an academic, that the location had unusual properties that deserve further investigation. That investigation never happened, not formally, not by anyone with resources or credibility, until me. I made contact with Raymond Chu in the second week of my research. He was 71 years old, retired, and living in a quiet house in Westerville. He agreed to speak with me over the phone. He was measured and precise in the way that retired academics often are, and he was very clear about one thing from the beginning of our conversation. He said, "I don't believe in ghosts, Mr. Mercer. I want to be clear about that. What I experienced in that cemetery was real, and it was disturbing, and I have spent 20 years not being able to explain it. But I don't believe in ghosts." And then he paused, and he said something that I have thought about every single day since. He said, "What I believe is that there are places in this world that carry weight, the weight of everything that happened in them. And some of that weight is heavy enough to press down on a living person in ways that science hasn't fully mapped yet. That's not supernatural. That's physics we don't fully understand yet." I thanked him. I wrote that down. And I began planning my night at Hollow Creek Cemetery. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because this is exactly the kind of story we go deep on here. Real places, real people, real things that happen in the dark that don't have easy explanations. If you've been looking for a channel that treats you like an intelligent adult and doesn't flinch from the uncomfortable truth, this is where you belong. Subscribe now. You don't want to miss what happens next. I spent 4 days preparing for the overnight stay. I acquired the necessary permissions from the Cemetery Trust through a formal documentary request, emphasizing the historical and archival nature of the project. They agreed with conditions. I was required to stay within the designated paths, avoid disturbing any graves or markers, and be off the property by 6 in the morning. I agreed to all of it. My equipment loadout was thorough but practical. I brought 3 cameras, 1 shoulder-mounted documentary camera for primary footage, 1 wide-angle camera on a tripod for fixed environmental shots, and 1 small personal camera worn on a chest rig for continuous first-person documentation. I brought a high-sensitivity audio recorder with external microphones, directional and omnidirectional. Because in my experience, what you hear in a place often tells you more than what you see. I brought a thermal imaging device, which I had borrowed from a colleague who used it for building inspections. I brought temperature gauges, a compass, and a barometric pressure monitor. I brought extra batteries, far more than I thought I would need. I brought a first aid kit, water, food, and a heavy-duty flashlight as backup to my primary headlamp. I brought my notebook. I always bring my notebook. I arrived at Hollow Creek Cemetery at 9:45 in the evening. The sun had been down for nearly 3 hours. The October air had that particular Ohio sharpness to it, not bitter cold yet, but with an edge that gets into your jacket if you're standing still. I parked on the access road just outside the main gate, loaded my equipment into a cart, and walked through the entrance alone. The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the absence of sound. There were sounds. Distant traffic on the highway a mile east, the occasional movement of branches in a light wind, the sound of my own footsteps on the gravel path. But underneath all of that, there was a quality to the silence that was different from the silence I'd experienced in other isolated places. It was dense. That is the only word I can find for it. Dense, like the air itself had weight. Like the quiet was something that was actively present rather than the passive absence of noise. I set up my first fixed camera near the main entrance, aimed down the central path that bisected the cemetery grounds. I set up the second fixed camera at the midpoint of the cemetery, aimed toward the oldest section in the northeast corner, the 1831 plots that Raymond Chu had mentioned. I activated the thermal device and began a slow walk of the perimeter to orient myself with the layout of the grounds before the night deepened. The cemetery was arranged in rough concentric rings, with the newest burials near the outer edges and the oldest in the center and northeastern quadrant. The headstones ranged from polished modern granite near the entrance to ancient weathered limestone markers so eroded that many of the inscriptions were entirely illegible. Some had sunk partially into the earth over the decades and centuries, leaning at angles that made them look like things trying to push their way out from below. That is an image I would come back to later that night. By 11 o'clock, I had completed my perimeter walk and settled into a position in the central section of the cemetery, equidistant from both fixed cameras and within clear line of sight of the older northeastern section. The temperature had dropped about 4 degrees since my arrival, which was consistent with the seasonal forecast. Nothing on the thermal device was reading anything unusual. The audio recorder was running continuously, capturing the ambient sound of the grounds. I sat on a folding stool I had brought, turned off my headlamp, and let my eyes adjust to the dark. It took about 10 minutes, and when my eyes adjusted, I saw the cemetery as it really was at night. The moon was at 3/4, and it was high enough in the sky to cast real light. Not bright light, not enough to read by, but enough to see the shapes of the headstones, the lines of the paths, the outline of the tree line at the cemetery's edge. Everything was grey and silver and black. The headstones threw small, sharp shadows. The trees were dark masses against a slightly lighter sky. It was beautiful in a way that I hadn't expected, and deeply, profoundly still. I made notes. I checked my equipment readings. I drank some water. I waited. For the first hour, nothing happened that I would categorize as unusual. The wind moved through periodically. The tree branches responded to it. The shadows shifted in natural ways. My audio monitor picked up ambient sounds consistent with an outdoor environment at night, distant wildlife, the occasional vehicle on the far road, the subtle acoustic texture of the open space itself. At 12:14 in the morning, things began to change. It started with my audio monitor. The levels, which had been sitting at a low, consistent range for over 2 hours, began to fluctuate. Not dramatically, Not in a way that would have looked unusual on a readout without context, but I was watching it closely, and the fluctuations had a quality that immediately caught my attention. They were rhythmic. Not mechanical rhythmic, not regular like a metronome, but rhythmic in the way that breathing is rhythmic. Slow, slightly variable with a natural rise and fall. I checked the directional microphone first, aiming it at the nearest section of headstones to the northeast. The reading deepened, not spiked, deepened, like I was aiming the microphone into something rather than at it. I put on my headphones and listened directly to the live audio feed. I want to be very careful about how I describe what I heard next, because I have a responsibility to be precise and honest about this. I did not hear voices. I did not hear anything that I would characterize as speech or language. What I heard was, and I have played this recording back dozens of times since that night, and I have had 2 audio professionals listen to it without giving them any context, and they have both used very similar language to describe it. What I heard was a layered, low-frequency sound that the audio professionals described as organic and respiratory in character. One of them said it sounded like being in a room where many people were asleep. The collective sound of slow, deep breathing multiplied and overlaid on itself. The sound was coming from below me, not from far below, not from some impossible depth. From a distance that felt immediately physically proximate, like it was coming from just beneath the surface of the ground. I sat very still for what I later calculated by checking my camera timestamp to be 4 minutes and 37 seconds. And in that time I did not move, and the sound continued, and my heart rate, which I can confirm because I was wearing a fitness monitor, increased from its resting level of 62 beats per minute to 109 beats per minute. And then the sound stopped. Not faded. Stopped. As if someone had simply closed a door. The silence that followed was different from the silence before it. Before, the silence had been dense. Now it was expectant. That is the word that comes to me, as if the silence itself was waiting. I pulled off my headphones. I looked around the cemetery, turning slowly in my position on the stool, using the moonlight to see as far as the shadows would allow. Nothing was moving. No figure, no shape, no disruption to the stillness that I could identify. I checked the thermal device. Nothing. I checked the temperature gauge. It had dropped another 3 degrees in the last 40 minutes, which was significant but not impossible for October in Ohio. I made notes. My handwriting, when I looked at the notebook afterward, was noticeably different from earlier in the evening. Smaller, more compressed, as if I had been trying to make myself physically smaller while writing. That is when I became aware of the figure near the tree line. I want to be precise about this. I did not see a figure appear. I became aware of a figure that was already there, as if my eyes had simply been sliding past it without registering it, and then suddenly resolved it into focus. It was at the northeastern edge of the cemetery, near the border between the old section and the tree line, approximately 60 to 70 feet from my position. It was the shape of a person, standing still, facing in my direction. I sat completely frozen for what felt like a very long time and was probably about 15 seconds. And then I did what I had trained myself to do in situations where my instincts were firing and my body was preparing to act before my mind had processed the situation. I made myself breathe, slowly, deliberately. I made myself think, the rational explanation. And I want to emphasize that I always start with the rational explanation, always, was that it was a person, a trespasser, someone who had come into the cemetery grounds after dark. It happened. Not commonly, but it happened. Teenagers, urban explorers, people who had their own reasons for being in a cemetery at night, none of them necessarily sinister. I activated my headlamp and raised my arm to signal my presence. "Hello," I called out, My voice sounded strange in the open space, absorbed by the density of the air. "I'm a filmmaker. I have permission to be here." No response. The figure did not move. I held my headlamp steady. At 60 to 70 feet, the beam reached the area of the tree line, but the figure, if it was a figure, was partially obscured by the shadow of a large oak at the edge of the path. I could see the outline. I could see that it was upright. I could see that it was still. I picked up my shoulder camera. I aimed it at the tree line and activated the camera's zoom function, watching the image on the small flip screen. The screen showed the tree line, the oak tree, the shadows between the trees, and nothing else, no figure. I lowered the camera and looked with my eyes. The shape was still there. I raised the camera and looked through the screen. The shape was not there. I did this 3 times. 3 times. With my eyes, I could see the outline of something standing at the tree line. 3 times. Through the camera's lens. There was nothing in that location. I am a documentary filmmaker. I understand cameras. I understand that lenses and screens mediate reality, and that this mediation can produce discrepancies. I know that the human eye, operating in low light and high stress, is capable of producing images that are not perfectly accurate representations of the physical world. I know all of this. I also know that what I experienced in that moment, the repetition of it, the consistency of it, the sheer stubborn physicality of what my eyes were reporting versus what the lens was reporting, that is not something I have encountered before or since, and I have been in a lot of dark, strange places. I stood up from my stool. I took 2 steps toward the tree line. The figure was gone, not retreated into the trees, not moved. Simply absent, as if the space where it had been had closed over it like water over a stone. I stood at the edge of the path for a long time. I checked the ground near the tree line with my flashlight. I found nothing, no footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed leaves, no sign that anything had been standing in that location. The thermal device showed no residual heat signature, nothing. I walked back to my stool. I sat down. I checked the time on my camera. It was 2:41 in the morning. The long hours before dawn are different from the hours before midnight. Before midnight, darkness is recent. The day is still close. Your body still carries the warmth and movement of daylight hours, and the dark feels like a temporary state, something that will be lifted. But after 2 in the morning, after 3, the dark begins to feel permanent. It begins to feel like the real state of things, like the light is the visitor, and the dark is what was always there. I know that's not rational, but I also know it's true. I stayed in my position until 3:15, reviewing my equipment readings, checking the audio monitor, writing notes. The cemetery was quiet in the way it had been quiet before the audio anomaly. Dense, but not expectant. Whatever had been present in that middle stretch of the night felt for the moment withdrawn, waiting. At 3:17, the battery in my primary shoulder camera died. I had packed extra batteries. I had packed more than I needed. I reached into my equipment bag and retrieved the backup battery pack, opened the camera, removed the dead battery, and inserted the fresh one. It was also dead. I checked my readout. 0%. A brand new, fully charged battery. I reached for the second backup. Dead. The third. Dead. I sat with 4 dead battery packs, a camera that wouldn't run, and an equipment bag full of gear that was now systematically beginning to fail. The thermal device, which had been running for over 5 hours without issue, went dark at 3:21. My temperature gauge stopped updating at 3:24. My audio recorder, the one piece of equipment I was most desperate to keep running, began throwing error messages at 3:26. Only the chest-rig personal camera, a small consumer-grade device with a non-replaceable internal battery that I used as a backup of last resort, was still functioning. I confirmed it was recording and left it running, and then the fixed cameras died, both of them, simultaneously, at 3:28. I was left in the cemetery with one small personal camera, a flashlight, my notebook, and whatever the moonlight was willing to provide. And then the moonlight changed, not dramatically, not the cinematic bank of clouds sweeping across the sky. The change was subtle, a dimming, a slight deepening of the grey, to something closer to true black, as if the moon's angle had shifted just enough to alter the quality of the light. The shadows among the headstones thickened. The spaces between the markers, which had been navigable in the partial light, became true dark. I became aware that I was very, very alone. That is a specific feeling. Not the general awareness that no one is nearby, not the intellectual knowledge that you are the only person in a given space. It is the feeling of aloneness as a physical presence, a weight that presses on the chest and slows the breathing and makes the small muscles of the face tighten involuntarily. I have felt it before in other dark places, and I have learned that it is a signal worth paying attention to, not necessarily a signal of danger, but a signal that the situation has changed in some way, that your body has registered before your conscious mind has caught up. I stood up from my stool. I faced the northeastern section of the cemetery, the oldest part, the 1831 plots, Raymond Chew's section. I couldn't tell you why I walked toward it, rather than away from it. I have asked myself that question many times since. I think the honest answer is that by that point in the night, I had crossed some threshold in myself, some line between the person who had arrived at the cemetery with equipment and a rational framework and a professional distance, and some other version of myself who was simply present in a place that was asking to be witnessed. I walked toward the oldest section of Hollow Creek Cemetery at 3:31 in the morning, with one small camera and a flashlight, and my notebook tucked under my arm. The headstones in the oldest section were different from those in the rest of the grounds. They were limestone, most of them, worn by nearly 2 centuries of Ohio weather into shapes that were more sculptural than architectural. Many had sunk into the earth at angles, or cracked along natural fault lines in the stone, or been colonized by moss and lichen to the point where they seemed less like human-made objects and more like geological formations, things that had always been part of the earth and had simply risen to the surface over time. The inscriptions that remained legible were simple: names, dates, occasionally a phrase, beloved, at rest, called home. The oldest dates I could find by flashlight were from 1833, 1836, 1841. The names were the names of ordinary mid-19th century Ohio: Harmon, Ridley, Bauer, Schaefer, Collins, people who had built the early infrastructure of the young state, who had farmed its soil and built its first roads, and died of the diseases that killed people in the early American Midwest without warning or mercy. Cholera, typhoid, influenza, things that took whole families in a matter of days. There was a particular cluster of small stones near the center of the old section, low to the ground, very eroded, arranged in a rough oval. I crouched to examine them more closely, and I realized that they were children's graves, 7 of them. The dates, where I could read them, spanned a single year, 1848, the same year, different months, but the same year, and the surnames on 5 of the 7 stones were the same. I sat with those stones for a long time. I don't know what I was feeling. Something between grief and reverence, and the particular kind of sorrow that comes from being confronted with the reality of lives that have been entirely forgotten. These children had existed. They had been real people with names and voices and the specific weight of a child's body, and they had all left the world within months of each other in the same year, and almost no one still living knew their names, and the stones that marked their places were so eroded that in another century there might be nothing left to mark them at all. I was crying. I didn't notice until I tasted salt. I wasn't sobbing. I wasn't making noise. But my eyes were running, and the tears were cold on my face in the October air, and that is when I heard it, not the layered breathing from earlier, something different, A single sound, clear, close, and completely impossible to explain away. A child laughing, brief, light, the specific quality of a young child's laugh, unself-conscious, uncomplicated, pure. It came from somewhere immediately to my left and slightly behind me, close enough that if a real child had been standing there, I could have reached out and touched them. I turned. There was nothing there. I swept the flashlight in a full arc. I stood and turned completely, checking every direction. I used the small chest camera to film the surrounding area, narrating what I had heard as I did it, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. Nothing. No child, no person, no source for what I had heard, but I had heard it. I am certain of that with a certainty that I don't feel about many things. I had heard a child laugh, clearly and closely, in the oldest section of Hollow Creek Cemetery at 3:44 in the morning. I stood among those small, eroded stones for another 20 minutes. I said nothing. I did nothing. I simply stood there and let the place be what it was, and whatever it carried, I let it carry it in my presence without flinching. And then I walked back to my equipment, packed what I could in the dark, and sat at the central position to wait for sunrise. At 4:52, the sky began to change. Not light, not yet, but a slight differentiation. A beginning of gradient at the eastern horizon, where the black began, almost imperceptibly, to consider becoming grey. And as that first suggestion of dawn began to develop, something in the cemetery changed too. The density I had felt in the air since arrival began to release. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the quality of the space changed. The weight lifted degree by degree, and by the time the first real grey light was coming from the east, the cemetery felt like a cemetery again. A quiet, old, sad, beautiful space full of human memory, rather than whatever else it had been in the hours between midnight and nearly 5. I sat and watched the sunrise complete itself over Hollow Creek Cemetery. I watched the headstones emerge from shadow one by one as the light found them. I watched the moisture on the grass catch the early light and hold it for a moment before the warmth took it. I watched the birds begin, first one somewhere in the tree line, and then a cascade of them, the morning coming alive with sound in the way that mornings always do, the world resuming its familiar rhythms. I felt with the light an enormous relief, and beneath the relief something more complex, something that I have been trying to put into words since that morning and have still not fully managed. What I experienced in Hollow Creek Cemetery on the night of October 14th is not something I can explain. I have tried. I am committed to rational inquiry. I believe in the primacy of evidence and the importance of not claiming more than the evidence supports. I'm not going to tell you that I spent the night in a cemetery and encountered the supernatural, because I don't have a framework for that claim that feels honest. What I can tell you is this: there are places in the world that carry weight. The weight of everything that happened in them. The weight of lives lived and ended and mourned and forgotten. The weight of the accumulated grief and love and fear and rest of generations of human beings who occupied a space and left some part of themselves in it. The way that everyone who has ever lived has left something behind that outlasts their body. Whether that weight is measurable by instruments we already have, or by instruments we haven't built yet, or whether it can only be measured by the sensitivity of a human being sitting alone in the dark and paying full attention, I don't know. I genuinely don't know, but I know it's real. I know it's there. I know that Hollow Creek Cemetery is full of it, and I know that the sound I heard near those children's graves, that small, clear, uncomplicated sound, was the most deeply and completely affecting thing I have ever heard in my life. I packed my equipment and left the cemetery grounds at 5:53 in the morning, 13 minutes before the conditions of my permission required. The access road was empty. The highway was quiet. The world was still waking up, and I drove home through the pale October morning and sat in my car in my driveway for a long time before I could make myself go inside. When I finally came in, I sat at my kitchen table. I opened my notebook to the page where I had written in that compressed, careful handwriting the notes from the middle of the night. I read them through from beginning to end. And when I reached the last entry, the one I had written at 3:46, 2 minutes after hearing the child's laugh, I found that I had written only one sentence. It said, "They are still here, and they know we are here, and that is enough." I don't remember writing that. I don't remember thinking it. But I believe it now, in whatever way a person can believe something that exists entirely outside of their ability to prove. They are still here, and they know we are here. And that, in the deepest, oldest, most human sense, that is enough. Now, I want to talk about what came after. Because the night in the cemetery was not the end of the story. It was, in a very real way, the beginning of it. In the 2 weeks following my overnight stay at Hollow Creek Cemetery, I went through the footage and audio from the night in exhaustive detail. The personal chest camera had captured over 4 hours of continuous footage, and despite the loss of my primary equipment, there was enough material to work with for a documentary presentation. The audio recorder had survived until 3:26, giving me approximately 5.5 hours of continuous ambient recording from the cemetery grounds, including the period in which I heard the layered breathing from below the earth. The first professional I brought the audio to was Marcus Webb, a sound engineer with 30 years of experience in both studio production and location recording. I told him nothing about where the recordings had been made or what I had experienced. I simply gave him the files and asked him to tell me what he heard. Marcus listened to the full recording over the course of 2 sessions. In the first session, he listened to the ambient period, the first 2 hours before anything unusual occurred. He said it was clean, unremarkable environmental audio. Background noise, wind, the natural acoustic texture of an open outdoor space. Standard. In the second session, he reached the period from 12:14 onwards. I was sitting across from him in his studio, watching his face through the soundproofing glass. He stopped the playback at 12:19. He rewound it. He played it again. He rewound it a second time. The third time he played that segment, he took off his headphones and looked at me through the glass with an expression that I have replayed in my memory many times since. It was not fear. It was something more careful than fear, something more considered. He said, "Where did you record this?" I told him. He nodded slowly. He said, "There's a frequency event here that I've never heard in an outdoor recording before. In a studio with very specific equipment and very specific conditions, you can capture something like this under controlled circumstances. But in the open air, in a field environment..." He trailed off. He put his headphones back on. He listened for another minute. Then he took them off again and said, "Whatever this is, it's coming from below the microphone, significantly below, and it's regular. It has a cadence. It sounds like breathing." He paused. Then he said, "A lot of breathing." He agreed to write a formal technical analysis of the recording. In his analysis, he identified what he called a subsurface acoustic signature, occurring at frequencies between 30 and 90 hertz, the lower range of human hearing, with a rhythmic pattern consistent with respiratory activity. He estimated, based on the complexity of the overlapping patterns within the signature, that if the sound was indeed being produced by a biological source, it would require a minimum of several dozen individual sources operating simultaneously. Several dozen, in a cemetery, below the surface. I want to be very clear about what I am and am not claiming here. I am not claiming that what Marcus Webb identified in that audio recording is evidence of the dead producing sound. I'm not making that claim because I cannot support that claim, and I will not make claims I cannot support. What I am saying is that something was producing that sound, and that Marcus Webb, a 30-year professional with no stake in the conclusion, identified it as a subsurface acoustic signature consistent with rhythmic biological activity, and that he had no technical explanation for its presence in an outdoor recording. Make of that what you will. The second professional I consulted was Dr. Elaine Forsyth, a geologist at Ohio State University, whom I approached after considering whether there was a geological explanation for the acoustic phenomenon. She listened to Marcus Webb's analysis, reviewed the frequency data, and offered the possibility that the sound could be produced by underground water movement or gas release through soil channels, both of which can produce low-frequency acoustic events detectable at the surface. It was a reasonable hypothesis. It was precisely the kind of rational alternative explanation I was looking for. It didn't entirely hold up. Dr. Forsyth's own caveat was this: the rhythmic regularity of the pattern was unusual for geological acoustic events, which tend to be arrhythmic and variable. The consistency of the breathing-like cadence was, in her words, atypical for a geological source. She couldn't rule it out, but she also acknowledged that she couldn't confidently rule it in. The investigation into the acoustic recording is ongoing. The footage from the chest camera has been reviewed in its entirety and contains 2 segments of note. The first is the segment in which I am filming the tree line, and the figure that I can see with my eyes is absent from the camera image. I have had 2 visual effects professionals and a camera engineer review this segment, and none of them have been able to produce a technical explanation that fully accounts for the discrepancy. One of the visual effects professionals, who has spent 20 years working on film productions and knows every way that optical systems can produce artifacts and illusions, said simply, "I don't know what to tell you. I've been staring at this for an hour, and I can't tell you why. What your eyes reported and what the lens reported were different." The second segment of note is the segment in which I'm crouching near the children's graves, and I hear the sound. The camera captured approximately 3 seconds of audio at that moment, and in those 3 seconds, in the background, very low, beneath my own breathing and the ambient sound of the cemetery, there is something. Marcus Webb identified it in his review of the footage audio. He described it as a brief high-frequency event, organic in character, consistent with juvenile vocalization. Consistent with juvenile vocalization in a cemetery at 3:44 in the morning. I have not returned to Hollow Creek Cemetery since that night. Not because I'm afraid to, or at least not only because of that, but because I made a decision, sitting among those small eroded stones in the dark, that whatever that place is and whatever it carries, it deserves to be left alone. It has been carrying its weight for a very long time, and it does not need me to come back with more equipment and more cameras and more frameworks for trying to fit it into categories it may not belong in. What I can do, what I did, is bear witness. Pay attention, take it seriously, document it with as much integrity as I could bring to it, and then tell you. That is what a documentary filmmaker is at the best of times, not an explainer, not a debunker, not a sensationalist, a witness. I witnessed something real in Hollow Creek Cemetery. I cannot tell you what it was. I can tell you that it was not nothing. I can tell you that the people who are buried there, the 3,000 named ones and the equal number unnamed, the farmers and the laborers and the mothers and the children, the ones from 1831 and the ones from yesterday, I can tell you that they existed, and that their lives were as real and as full and as complicated as yours and mine, and that the places where they rest are worth treating with the gravity that represents. I can tell you that a child laughed in the dark, near a cluster of small eroded stones, in the oldest section of a cemetery in Ohio, at 3:44 in the morning. And I can tell you that when I heard it, I did not feel afraid. I felt something that I can only describe as accompanied, not alone. Whatever happened to Gerald Watts in that cemetery in 1987, whatever it was that left him sitting on the ground at dawn with his shoes missing and his hands folded, I think I understand it a little better now. Not the specifics, but the feeling of it. The feeling of being in a place that has more reality than you expected, that presses on you in ways you don't have language for, that leaves you sitting very still while you try to reassemble your framework for what is and isn't possible. Gerald Watts never spoke about that night. He took it with him. I understand the impulse. There is something about these experiences that resists language, that feels diminished by the attempt to translate them into words and explanations and documentary footage. Something that belongs to the territory of direct experience and remains only partly accessible through description. But I also believe that these things need to be said, that the places which carry weight deserve to have their weight acknowledged, that the people who had experiences they couldn't explain deserve to have those experiences treated seriously rather than dismissed or mocked. That the whole strange, complicated, honest truth of what it is to be a living person moving through a world that is older and stranger and more layered than our daily routines allow us to remember that truth is worth telling, even when you can't fully explain it, even when the explanation isn't available, especially then. If you watched this far, if you stayed with me through all of it, then I want you to know that I see you. That means something to me. It means you're the kind of person who takes things seriously, who sits with discomfort without reaching for the easy answer, who is willing to consider that the world might be more than our daylight frameworks contain. If you're already subscribed to this channel, thank you. You are exactly who this channel exists for. If you're not subscribed, this is the moment. This channel is where we go to the places most people avoid, ask the questions most people won't ask, and take the answers seriously, no matter where they lead. Hit subscribe now. You don't want to miss what comes next. Like this video if it moved something in you. Share it with someone who would take it seriously. We need more people who take things seriously. And leave a comment. Tell me, what is the one thing you've experienced in your life that you have never been able to fully explain? The thing that still sits with you? The thing that doesn't fit? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and I promise you, you are not as alone in that experience as you think you are, because that's what Hollow Creek Cemetery taught me more than anything else. We are not alone. We have never been alone. And in the oldest, darkest, most honest part of the night, that is not a frightening thought. That is the most comforting thought there is. If you watched until here, it's because you liked this case. Leave a comment saying, I watched until here, so I can get to know you and know who really enjoys the stories here on this channel. I want to hear from you. I want to know you're out there. Drop it below. Thank you for being here. Thank you for witnessing this with me. Until next time, stay curious, stay honest, and never stop paying attention to the things that don't have easy explanations. They are the most important things of all.